So, hello and welcome everybody to the Intereconomics and SEPS conference on De-globalization, a new world order, ? My name is Christian Breuer. I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal Intereconomics, and we are very happy to organize this conference together with SEPS. The topic is very interesting, and we received a large number of registrations today. The conference will be recorded. Everybody is able to use the question and answer function, but only speakers are able to unmute and discuss. We look forward to an interesting debate today with numerous excellent speakers, which I also welcome here. To begin today, we have a special highlight. Professor Yayati Ghosh will give a keynote on the topic of globalization, deglobalization. Professor Yayati Ghosh is a renowned scholar in the fields of international and political economy from the University of Massachusetts and Amherst, and served earlier at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She received her PhD at Cambridge University and received numerous prizes for outstanding research, among others the United Nations Development Program Award for Excellence in Analysis and the Research Prize of the International Labour Organization. In 2021, she was appointed the World Health Organization Council on the Economics of Health for All, chaired by Mariana Mazzucato, and one of her recent books is The Making of a Catastrophe, the COVID-19 pandemic and the Indian economy. Professor Yayati Ghosh, it is a pleasure to welcome you here today. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much. It is also a great pleasure for me to join you on this very important topic, and with such an interesting panel of speakers, I feel very privileged to be amongst you. So let me go straight into the issue and provide a little bit of background, because I do know that you're going to be getting much more detailed discussion of trade fragmentation and similar issues subsequently. I think we need to remind ourselves that this current phase that we're seeing is actually part of a much broader tendency in the global economy for progressive decline in terms of growth. Now, what we have been seeing is that the global economy has actually been slowing for a while, really progressively over the decades. And this has occurred even during the period of globalization, which many people often forget. They assume that the period from the 1990s onwards was this whole new phase in which capitalism was much more dynamic. But in fact, if you look at the decadal averages in terms of the growth of output, the growth of investment shares in the economy, and particularly the significance of private as opposed to public investment, you find all of them have been decelerating. The peak is really in the 70s, and it decelerates as a share of GDP thereafter. And this is something that's quite important, because finally capital accumulation is the basis for our current global economy. That's why it's there in a way. That's the purpose of global capitalism. So it's no longer dynamic in that sense. Yes, there's dynamism in certain kinds of invention and innovation, which there always has been. Technological progress is again, something which we now recognize is a major feature of economic activity over the past 2 centuries. But what we have now realized, and it's come very sharply into focus, I would argue, in the last 3 years, is that this is a system that has many other weaknesses. And of course, the most striking weakness is the lack of resilience to shocks. COVID-19 was certainly a shock of that nature, but the lack of resilience to the shocks created by the Ukraine war and the food and fuel price increases, the lack of resilience to the shocks created by lack of demand because of inequality, the lack of resilience to the possibility of debt crises. All of these have been very evident in the last few years. And of course, we have seen in this period massive increases in inequality. It's hard to remember that the whole movement against the 1%, the many social protests by the 99%ers, and all of that happened more than a decade ago. And actually inequalities have spiraled since then, both spatial, geographical, locational inequalities and vertical inequalities by category of industry, by employer versus worker, by large capital versus smaller capital, by other criteria. whether it's men and women or social category or you name it. Inequalities of every different type have massively spiraled. And of course, those create new forms of fragility, social and political tensions of different kinds, which then have their impact on economic policy and on economic activity. And of course, all of this has occurred in the face of increasing threats to the planet and the environment. We are now living in a world of very dramatic and rapid climate change and all of the implications. We are discovering that it affects all parts of the planet and that people cannot really be immune from its effects. While, of course, some regions are much worse affected than others. In fact, pretty much every part of the planet, the inhabited planet, is being affected. And this, in turn, is something that has really happened mainly in the last 30 years. We know that, if you look at the long run of history, dramatic increases in carbon emissions, etc., certainly it's all happened over the past century. But more than half of that has occurred just in the past 30 years. And more than half of that, in fact, about 70% of that comes from just a few rich countries that account for 14% of the global population. So it's true that China and India have dramatically increased emissions, but they're still big players. If you're looking at the total stock of carbon debt, if you look at the emissions to date, and even over the last 30 years. So this is the background in which we're now talking about de-globalization. I personally believe that a lot of that de-globalization, the origins of it are political. They are most clearly expressed in the period of President Trump, when he essentially identified China as an enemy. It was seen as a trade war. It's not really a trade war between the US and China. It's a technology war. It's a war over who will control the technologies of the current, present, and the future. And of course, trade is being utilized as one of the means to fight that war, but it's not the only means. And of course, it's then been, the fragmentation has been further hastened by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a completely unwarranted invasion, which nonetheless has left a lot of the rest of the world looking on as, certainly as collateral damage, but also as almost neutral bystanders. Not because they necessarily forgive an unwarranted invasion into another country, but because we have all seen this before. We've seen this being done by the United States and its coalitions of the willing in the Middle East. We have seen unwarranted invasions of economies on false pretexts, like the possession of weapons of mass destruction. We have seen futile wars being fought for decades, destroying a country and its population, and then just being ended without any sense of responsibility, as in Afghanistan. So, in a sense, the political elements of that defragmentation have also led to a fragmentation in terms of the perceptions of how that global economy has to be run. I identified a number of weaknesses in the international economy today, but I would like to specify that many of those weaknesses are actually the result of the global architecture. They're not just things that have happened and that we couldn't avoid and so on. They are creations of our institutions and the way we have managed our economic policy. So specifically, I would argue, it's the nature of the architecture of economic integration that is largely to blame for the mess that we are in today. So what is that? What are the elements of that? First of all, there is the architecture of trade, of course, embodied in the World Trade Organization and its many agreements. But what it has done is inevitably create two kinds of very extreme vulnerability. One is much more vulnerability across the supply chain. Because of the fact that trade is more open, more integrated, you got the development of vertically disintegrated production, where different parts of any commodity were made in different parts in different localities, depending on where it was cheaper or more advantageous or had more tax relief, etc. And so there was no one unitary place where different products were made. That is, of course, at one level, very convenient, and it enables just-in-time production. You don't hold inventories, all of that. But it also implies much greater vulnerability. And we saw that vulnerability during the COVID pandemic and subsequently during the war. And of course, now, because of the geopolitical tensions and the sanctions, we have seen how supply chains are affected. We know that that affects not just supply, but inflation, which has become a major political issue in large parts of the world, and that it has impacts on people's standards of living and their attitudes towards the economy. We have seen that trade has impacted on essential goods and services, and particularly in the low and middle income countries, it has impacted on food and food sovereignty. So the agreement on agriculture essentially made many more economies less self-sufficient in terms of basic grains. And that is a huge issue when you have huge volatility in grain markets, which we of course have. And we've really had that since 2006 onwards. And that means that importing countries are deeply fragile and susceptible to all kinds of changes. It could be a change in the global food price. It could be a change in the capital flows your country gets, which forces your currency to devalue. It could be all kinds of other changes. But we now recognize that many more people, more than 1 billion people, according to the FAO's estimates, and more than 3 billion, if you look at the broader FAO estimate, are vulnerable to these fluctuations and are in the category of chronically undernourished because they cannot afford what the FAO sees as a nutritious diet because of all of these changes that have occurred in patterns of trade. And so then we have the issue of investment. The idea of globalization was to ensure that money flows from the rich to the poor, from capital endowed nations to capital poor countries, and that they would thereby be enabled to grow. The reality has been the opposite. The South has supplied resources to the North, financial resources in particular. Particularly developing countries in Asia, but actually every developing country, every developing region has supplied financial resources to the United States especially, but also to other countries in Europe, because there is inevitably a tendency of flight to safety in periods of crisis, and safety is of course US Treasury bills, or a tendency to flight towards more secure assets. And therefore we have found that central banks in Asia and in Latin America have been holding huge amounts of US Treasury bills and other very safe assets in the North, that even countries that receive large gross inflows, like Malaysia or Thailand or India, in fact, also have large gross outflows. So their net inflows are relatively small, and in fact, often do not really contribute to investment. In the case of India, our reserves, 70% of it is in the form of capital inflows that are essentially speculative, that are hot money and could leave at any time. So we have a real conundrum that the financial globalization has not led to more money being available in the areas that need it, or from rich to poor. It has actually meant the opposite flow. In fact, water has defied gravity and flown upwards in this case. And that in turn has meant a massive impact on the economic policies of low and middle income countries. You're so worried about capital flight that you don't dare do expansionary monetary or fiscal policy, even when the rest of the world is doing it. That was especially evident during the pandemic. Between January 2020 and March 2021, the rich countries, the total additional public spending, according to the IMF, was about $11 trillion. 85% of that came from 10 countries. 55% of that came from just the US. And to give you an idea of what that means, the US spent on average between $25,000 to $30,000 per capita additionally in this period. Low-income countries spent on average additionally $2 per capita. $2. That's the kind of difference we're talking about, 25,000 and 2. And of course, it also meant that even the emerging markets, the so-called emerging markets, today they are submerged markets other than China. But the emerging markets spent less than they had spent after the global financial crisis, because they were worried about maintaining fiscal balances, about capital flight in case credit rating agencies decided that it was not okay to spend more. And that in turn meant that the recovery has been less buoyant, employment remains very low, fragilities remain. And finally, the last element of the global architecture that has been a huge impediment and is also remaining an impediment to any kind of progress in the future is the concentration of knowledge that is embedded in intellectual property rights. The TRIPS agreement and the extensive use of that, and the TRIPS plus kinds of measures that have been imposed in so many countries and through many trade agreements or economic partnership agreements, has really meant that certain large global companies, dominantly based in the North, control the important knowledge for everything that matters. We saw that during the pandemic with the vaccine production and the limitations on vaccine supply that were enforced by the fact that these large companies maintained monopolies that were the result of public research and public subsidies. Despite the fact that their R&D had been almost entirely funded and protected during the pandemic for the vaccine production, they retained the monopoly rights that prevented them from sharing this knowledge with other producers across the world. And so, for example, even today, less than a quarter of the African population has been fully vaccinated. But of course, because we did not vaccinate the whole world, which we could have done, we got renewed variants of the disease, and we have COVID still rearing its ugly head in different waves across the world in a very sort of almost stupefyingly stupid strategy of vaccine nationalism that really comes back to bite your own tail. But anyway, we find the same problem occurring today with all green technologies, which remain heavily monopolized and controlled. We cannot green the world. We cannot have a Green New Deal globally until we rectify this and resolve the issue of the control over knowledge, which is inhibiting a huge range of essential green technologies from being implemented in the global south, where it has to be done. We cannot get any mitigation of the climate change, and certainly we will not get adaptation without much more widespread use of these green technologies, which means we have to make them available. Finally, I will just make the point that all of these changes, and of course the recent geopolitical changes, the fragmentations of supply chains, the sanctions, the US-China wars, all of these things have created much more fragmentation in trade. And that certainly has massive implications. But finance is still not disintegrated. And finance is still king, or emperor, if you like. Finance still rules the global economy. And that's crucial because that also affects real trade and investment. And the fact that finance continues to move in these extremely volatile and unstable ways, that it holds governments to ransom in terms of the policy measures they can undertake, that it prevents the systematic investment in green technologies and controls and continues to subsidize investment in brown technologies. All of that has to change if we want any kind of real transformation of the world. So we are deglobalized in some ways. We are ultimately not deglobalized in one of the most important ways, that is finance. And until that happens, unfortunately, both trajectories are heading us, hurtling us towards doom and disaster. On that very depressing note, let me stop because I'm sure there will be reactions.
Okay, many thanks. Yes, I will have a look into the Q&A. If there are questions, just write them there. I cannot see some at the moment, but we have 10 minutes to discuss, so that's great. Thank you, Yayati. I think it is indeed a bit depressing, but in the context of the new geopolitical tensions, you mentioned the technology war, not a tariff or trade war, but more like a technology war. How do you think in that context between the US and China, how could you arrive how would you have an idea how to solve the challenges of our time, like the climate change, inequality problems? Is it possible, and how?
Ultimately, global cooperation is essential. You can't do this without, internationalist framework. You can't. And the sad truth currently is that ultimately all of the important countries are in a very nationalist framework. And I am hoping that enlightened self-interest will triumph, because I do believe it's in the self-interest of G7, of China, of Russia. It's in their self-interest to cooperate on these matters. It's not them being kind to other countries. Because, yes, we can create these fragmented different blocks and try and get trading in all of these. We will not get changes in the things that matter. Certainly, definitely climate change, the ability to cope, humanity's ability to cope with climate change, we will not get changes in that. And we will certainly also not get changes in all of the new threats which could come up. We know that there will be new pandemics. I mean, it's not anymore can it happen? It is when will it happen? We know that there will be other new forms of climate change related diseases. We know that there are other forms of vulnerability and instability that just come out of the sheer inequalities in the world, where people get angry and then do crazy things. And we cannot prevent these unless we actually cooperate to build a new and different architecture. There are many ideas about that. I am on a board of the UN on effective multilateralism, where we're considering many different options, how we need to restructure the IMF and World Bank, for example, how we need to alter the ways in which we look at the governance of things that affect the planet, the global commons. And so we really do have to think about that new architecture. And we have to persuade the countries that matter. And sadly, it's only about 10 countries that matter in terms of determining the direction. But we have to make them realize that it is in their own self-interest, that it's not something that is just about being nice to another country. It is really about the common fate of humanity in which they are part.
Many thanks. There was one question just arriving on that issue. Who can drive the necessary changes? You mentioned the United Nations. You also mentioned the international organizations. Maybe we have to reorganize them, or the G20. You have an idea about that?
Yes, absolutely. So the IMF and the World Bank were created in the mid-20th century in a very different world. They are no longer fit for purpose. The IMF is supposed to ensure financial stability and ensure that funds go from rich to poor. Neither of those is happening. For financial stability, it has to be much quicker to respond. It has to be much more open to using the measures like liquidity creation, creating more SDRs and so on, as a cheap, easy, and immediate way to reduce some of the immediate financing problems, especially when they're much widespread. It's not 1, 2, or 3 countries, it's 52 countries on the verge of debt default, for example. It has to be much quicker in terms of reorganizing the debt restructuring. Now, how can the IMF do that? Well, currently the problem is really that the voting shares in the IMF are too heavily controlled by the United States and Europe. Again, this is outdated. This has to be revised. It's not easy. It's not going to be something easy, but we have to make the IMF an institution that is fit for purpose. Similarly, the World Bank, which was created really to help fund reconstruction in Europe after the Second World War and a little bit of development. But a multilateral bank today has the potential to enable green investments in a global public investment format. There are excellent proposals about how we could organize global public investment and how we could ensure that it goes to the places that it needs. But green technologies and green investments are the most obvious thing to do here. So the World Bank also has to actually become a genuine development bank for the 21st century. It cannot stay in that old mold. Once again, governance is one of the problems, but the way it's organized, the way it plans its activities, just like the IMF, these are all outdated. These are all stuck in a very, sort of late 20th century accounting view of how to give a loan and get it back. This is not the way the governments who run it behave. The governments who run it, as we saw during the pandemic, when they need money, they find it. They take it out of the hat and they use it. That's really how the global money should be organized. That's really how the global financial architecture should be organized.
Many thanks. I have one more question because of the idea of the technology war between the two maybe powers. How would you see that? Is it like a trade war, or is it that they try to? I mean, usually we would say that technology could be, as you mentioned, with capital flows, a development project that you can use to provide development. But if you have a technology war, how would that look like?
Yes, you see, I think a lot of this really also has to do with how China proposes to play it. And the signals are not very clear at the moment. I would have said, if you had asked me this question 3 years earlier, I would have said, I believe China is actively going to be promoting the use of its finance and technology in the developing world to enlarge its own soft and hard power. It's less evident today. The reactions to the debt crisis in both Zambia and Sri Lanka have been, unexpected, I would say. The playing hardball with a number of the countries which it has been financing recently have also been unexpected. The the lack of incentive to share technologies has also been a bit of a surprise. So I'm not sure, but a lot depends on how both the US and China play it in terms of whether they see it as a war with each other, a war to the finish, or whether they see this as more one of, generating power blocks that they can influence and control, which would have a very different outcome. I've just noticed another question here. If there's time, I would like to answer.
Yes.
Whether I have, what do I say to Angus Deaton's argument that deglobalization can be positive to the rest of the world. So, I do believe that periods of deglobalization, we've had them in the past, the 1930s, the 1890s, we've had these periods of globalization, deglobalization in the past. And those have been the periods when new powers have emerged. In fact, autonomous development is more possible when the rules of the game no longer apply, because the rules of the game are typically designed to favor the more powerful, and they tend to prevent the rise of the less powerful. When those rules are not applied, when those rules are being blown up, is when there is more possibility for autonomous development. And I do believe that's the case even today. But the difference today is that there is much greater financial integration. So that autonomous development has got to also take the form of putting limits on finance, of actually controlling capital flows, doing what are called capital management techniques today, so that they cannot be destabilizing, they cannot prevent your autonomous fiscal policies, they cannot prevent you from taxing those whom you feel have to be taxed, including multinational companies that get away with paying nothing, and the very rich who park their money in tax havens and so on. So we need, if this deglobalization is to be able to generate the possibility of autonomous development in other countries, it has to be a much greater deal. It has to go beyond trade. It really has to cover finance, and it has to be more strategic in its orientation. It has to be part of an overall industrial policy scenario where you are seeking to promote particular activities for the future.
Okay, one last question from Alexander Sandkamp. I just see here, if I got you right, I mean, this is my interpretation. If I got you right, there is a possibility to come out with a more positive view on deglobalization if you include finance. On the other hand, you have globalization and international trade, which came along with significant economic growth. Is it contradicting each other, or is it how do you interpret that?
No, I think what was really interesting about the globalization phase that we've just been through is that the North opened up its markets to the South in ways that it hadn't before. I mean, in the past, it was only really strategically important countries like South Korea, Taiwan, etc., that got access to the markets easily. The period of globalization from the 1990s enabled China, for example, to access US markets in a way that it was completely impossible before. But remember, China's integration with the global economy was extremely strategic. They retained certain import controls. They insisted that all the FDI coming in would be in the form of joint ventures, which would share the technology. They had very significant conditions in the way that they globalized. And it was those that have enabled them to be such a huge beneficiary of that process. Other countries that didn't put those conditions, no, we ended up being deindustrialized. We ended up with stalled industrialization or deindustrialization. We ended up shifting from subsistence crops to cash crops in a way that has made us more fragile and more dependent on food aid. We didn't gain necessarily from that globalization because we didn't do it in the same strategic way with industrial policy. So what I'm really now saying is that whether we globalize or deglobalize, it has to be strategic. You have to do it in a way that retains autonomous policy.
Okay, thank you for that. I got that. Thank you. I've seen more questions in the Q&A, but I'm so sorry because we are already behind the time. So I will go. I will thank you, Jayati Ghosh, and I will give the mic to Cynthia Al-Sidi for the first session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian, for handing it over to me. Many thanks to Professor Jayati Ghosh for this super interesting keynote speech and such a big overview about globalization and what is currently happening. We actually heard several times the word de-globalization, and this is one of the aspects that we are going to discuss in this first panel session. The title is De-globalization or New Globalization. We actually would like to put on the table the question of whether we are moving towards a more deglobalized world or other form of globalization, to a certain extent in response to the changes which have been driven by COVID, now the shock associated with the war in Ukraine and with the energy and food crisis. In order to discuss this issue, I have with me an excellent panel of speakers. I would like to invite them to switch on the cameras so that we have them on screen. Let me quickly introduce all of them. We have Simon Evenet. Very welcome, Simon. He is Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. And he is the founder of the St. Gallen Endowment, the new home of the Global Trade Alert Initiative, a leading independent trade policy monitoring initiative. Simon has very long and extensive academic experience both in trade and in trade policy. We have then Alicia Garcia Herrero. She is a senior fellow at Bruegel, and she is also chief economist for Asia and Pacific at Natixis, the investment bank. Alicia combines really the academic knowledge and really the market experience. She has great knowledge of China. To me, she is one of the main experts when it comes to Chinese economy. And then last but not least, we have Alexander Sandkamp, he's professor at the Kian Institute. Alexander is quantitative trade economist. He has done quite a bit of work on global value chains, and I'm sure he will share some insights with us. But without further ado, I would like to start with Simon Evenet. I ask him to give us a bit of an overview of where we stand in terms of globalization, given the impact of COVID, but also to give us his view about the state of the trade world system. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. I will share some slides with you because there's an old saying that a chart is worth 1,000 words, and I would like to share with you quite a lot of data about how governments have been responding to the pandemic and the developments since the global financial crisis. Okay, I have erased my slides. I hope you can see them. If you cannot, please say so. Essentially, I want to focus on the fallout from the pandemic and geopolitics on the world trading system. My focus will largely be on the policy choices and that have resulted, less so much on the actual economic outcomes, which I think are rather well known. I'm going to advance the following arguments in this presentation. The first is that I'm going to situate the analysis by looking at the pandemic compared to the pre-pandemic era. The first argument I want to make is that the world trading system, at least as far as policy stance was concerned, was nominally open and heavily distorted by public policy even before the pandemic hit. And I think this will be news to some people for reasons that I will explain. When the pandemic hit, we did see security of supply considerations lead to sector-specific measures, and this has resulted in a new form of import substitution, and not the old import substitution policies of raising tariffs and trying to develop domestic industries behind those tariff walls. This time around, it's just outright subsidization of local producers. The third point I want to make is that the US-China trade war was a precursor to today's geopolitically driven trade narrative. What is unclear to me is how much of that narrative is actually translating into new policy. We are seeing some developments on both sides of the Atlantic. but more importantly, whether this is actually translating into business decisions on the ground. And here I'll make a few observations. Overall, I want to argue that when you look at the facts and the evidence, there is a serious mismatch between the fashionable self-serving narratives of strategic autonomy, friendshoring and alike, and the reality that's going on the ground. And this ought to worry any of us who are interested in evidence-based policymaking as opposed to policy-based evidence-making. All right, let me start off by showing you the development of the distortions to world trade since the global financial crisis hit. I'll draw from the work of the Global Trade Alert, which is an initiative that has been tracking public policy changes affecting the trading system since November 2008. What I have on this chart is for global goods trade, a chart showing how much of global goods trade is covered by trade distortions of different types. And the trade distortions I have in mind here are your traditional tariff barriers, trade barriers like quotas, also behind the border barriers like local content requirements. I have in mind here firm-specific corporate subsidies, government procurement measures. What I do not include in these charts are anything to do with technical regulations, TBT and SPS as we call them in the trade world. As this chart shows, by the time we get even to 2013, over 70% of world goods trade was facing trade distortions, which were not there when the global financial crisis hit. So what we have seen is a massive expansion in the amount of trade that has been influenced by policies which favor local firms. I've put in place a vertical line to highlight when the trade war began between the United States and China, and you can see that most of the damage, expansion in trade distortions had already happened beforehand. And so the trade war literally accumulates what had already happened. And of course, the measures taken since the pandemic began have further added to this. So the notion that the world trading system was doing just fine until Donald Trump started the trade war should be set aside. This is factually inaccurate. What governments were doing were heavily distorting trade flows, but not in the 1930s manner, in a different manner, which I'll show you. And furthermore, you can see from the different colors in this chart that the number of times that different amounts of trade were hit has accumulated as well. So it's not just single hits to a particular trade flow. This chart is calculated using extremely fine-grained trade data, the most fine-grained trade data available in the world. Underlying it is probably about 400 million calculations. So that gives you a sense of what we have to track in order to be able to come to these conclusions. So the first thing is the trading system was in trouble anyway. Now, the question you might want to ask yourself is, why don't I know this? Well, the principal reason for this is that most of the official monitoring of trade policy has only tracked 1930s style trade protectionism, which is basically tariffs, quotas, and alike. And on the left-hand side here, I have, and here I want you to focus on the red and the green line, essentially estimated the shares of world trade that have been covered by trade restrictions of the traditional type and trade reforms of the traditional type. And if you read the official reports from the WTO and elsewhere, they paint a picture of a system which is managing to do fine. And that's because they've focused on yesterday's trade policy interventions. Once you add in the amount of trade which has been covered by subsidies to domestic firms and subsidies provided to exporters, then you can see that much, much more of world trade is affected. And so the narrative that somehow this system was doing well before the trade war and before the pandemic is very heavily skewed by what policymakers were tracking, or at least what officials were tracking. The subsidy action has been quite significant. On the right-hand side, I show you the growing resort to subsidies by China and the European Union. The Americans actually cut back on the number of new subsidies they award during the last decade. But of course, this number spikes with the pandemic in all of these three jurisdictions and has subsequently remained high. So subsidies are really where the action is these days. And this was going to prove to be the case when we get into the pandemic era as well. Once the COVID hits, first it hits in medicine and then medical goods And then, of course, later we have food security concerns. In the area of medical goods, the item which received, of course, a lot of attention was the sharp increase in resort to the number of export controls. And that's witnessed. You can see that in the left-hand chart here, which shows the weekly total numbers of different types of trade policies in force. And you can see in the light brown line that the number of export controls in effect in medical goods surged in the first and second quarter of 2020. But more importantly, many, or perhaps as importantly, many governments also liberalized import policies on medical goods and alike, which was a very sensible policy response. And so the narrative has grown up about how these export controls disrupted supply chains, et cetera, but in fact, the public policy response was much more comprehensive and often involved resort to trade reforms. On the right-hand side, you can see the contribution of the G20 week by week, and you can see that the big players really are very much responsible for the import restrictions which have been in effect, and for all of the policy interventions that we have seen. And so the big players are the ones who either have shown leadership or not, and this is, I think, where the concern linking big players to supply chain disruption, to weaponizing flows of medical goods has come in. So this is the developments in the area of medical goods. As far as food security is concerned, there were concerns in 2020 that we might see another spate of export controls on food. This, by and large, did not happen. Instead, we saw a wave of import reforms, which is good news. And in 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, of course, similar concerns were expressed. We have seen a big jump in the number of export controls this year, but we've also seen a big jump in the number of import reforms and of import restrictions. So again, the public policy response has been much more nuanced than often the narrative of weaponizing globalization has suggested. And I think this needs to be taken account of in any fact-based assessment as to how the trading system has been doing. So we can see here then that when we look at this, that the responses have been quite varied. Again, the G20 makes a significant contribution. Let me just conclude then with one slide interpreting these developments. We have had a lot of talk about the weaponization of trade, and this has been used as part of a narrative advocating more autonomous or more autonomy in production and in trade policy and decoupling. I would argue that the amount of weaponization has been confined to a small number of sectors. And indeed, in those sectors, we've not just seen weaponization, we've also seen rational policy responses of governments getting rid of trade barriers. So I would caution against this juggernaut, which appears to be unfolding in Washington and Brussels, about how weaponization is a principal feature of the world trading system. It's not. That is not what has happened. The second thing is there has been, of course, growing geopolitical rivalry, and this has led to calls for economies to decouple, for groups of countries to get together. Essentially, these are calls for gangs to be formed, and these gangs essentially will take action which often violates the most favored nation principle of the world trading system. And of course, we have seen the political opportunism translate into naked subsidization of a few favored sectors in this. And I think this is actually where a lot of action is, and where we have documented a lot of what's going on. Many governments have responded to the concerns about security of supply by essentially subsidizing the expansion of domestic production. And this is essentially subsidy-driven import substitution policy, which has been adopted in recent years. Now, all of this has, of course, weakened or paralyzed, actually, an already weakened World Trade Organization, where it is very difficult to have conversations about subsidies now and other matters. And I think although brave efforts are being made by the current leadership of the WTO to take matters forward, we should expect more paralysis in Geneva as we go forward. And the last thing I would do is just to step back and I really urge thoughtful people to start thinking about the narrative that they are using, because we have essentially had a relatively open but bastardized trading system. This is now being, people are now talking about fragmenting that system into something which is nothing less than economic gang warfare. And gang warfare is never particularly pretty. I think we need to ask hard questions about the costs of deglobalization and the cost of this gang warfare. And the other thing I think policymakers need to be asking, and officials need to be asking, is whether or not international business is really prepared to abandon all of the investments they have made over the last few decades and decoupling. I think the evidence that we have seen of actual divestment from Russia after the invasion of Ukraine has shown that very few Western firms are prepared to completely sever their ties. And even the ones who have sold out, many of them have retained options to buy back in 5, 10, or 15 years. So I think the policy narrative is detached from the underlying economic, business, and factual base. And this worries me intensely that we're talking ourselves into economic gang warfare. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Simon. This was extremely interesting. I have actually a few questions. I will keep them for later. I would also invite the people in the audience to think of questions and maybe start to type in them in the queue using the Q&A function. For the time being, I would like to move to Alicia. Alicia, I ask you to share your thoughts on how you see globalization and the role of China in globalization. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes, very well.
Good. Okay, so it's very nice to be here. I've listened attentively to Simon because I love your research, Simon. On you have really wonderful data. So we use it very often, and it's very nice to share basically views and of course the rest of the panel is just because I just heard Simon that I'm focusing on that. But what I'm going to do is to talk about deglobalization forces. I know the word is sorry, I was disabled to share my screen, so maybe if you can allow me, I will share a few slides. I know it's a tricky word because it brings somehow ideas of I don't know, of things we don't want to see in a way, yeah, and I understand that very well. But at the end, we also need to check whether this is happening and what it means for the world, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trade, not too much because a lot has been covered, although I will show a few graphs on value chain data. I'm going to show a little bit on tech decoupling, but also people-to-people and financial deglobalization. That might be the most exaggerated word because I don't think we're there yet, but I do want to show that there is some forces in the making for that to be a problem. And I actually think that financial deglobalization will be probably the biggest problem because of its immediateness if it were to happen. So the first thing is trade. Of course, many look at just gross trade data, and of course it's back to growth. And we also look at US-China trade, and we see a bump, also EU-China trade for that matter. But I think it's important to realize that when you look, and this is a recent paper by the Peterson, which I think is quite interesting, looking at basically at the difference between US-China trade and US trade with the rest of the world. And you can see there that no matter the recovery, which is obvious since the pandemic, it's much less intense than for the US with the rest of the world. And in a way, I'm also showing here just with gross data that after that huge blip in 2021, it's still obviously not, I mean, it's not growing at least as fast as prior to the trade war. So that's one thing to note. And then moving to supply chains, what I want to show is that, using input-output data, it's very clear that when you look at so basically the size of the value chain, and this is UNTAC data, so many countries, you can see that the global participation to value chains is shrinking since the global financial crisis. Now, that general move is very different across regions. So when you look at participation in the global value chain, of course, very large I use Germany, although we have European data, but there's also the issue of intra-European trade data. So to avoid that, I'm just showing Germany here, but the trend is very similar. So you can see that while we're, of course, very integrated trade-wise, input-output data shows that it's that integration of Germany with the rest of the world, and again, Europe as a whole, as I said, is shrinking. The opposite, not the opposite, but this is much less the case for China, and the US is in the middle. So while still the level of integration is less, interestingly, the trend is less acute for China. And when you look at actually the reason behind this different behavior, what you can see is that China has been integrating vertically very fast, and Germany has been basically doing the opposite. And this is in two forms. One is the foreign value added of exports, which is basically decreasing massively in China. So in other words, China is integrating it vertically and using less imports or less foreign goods for its exports. And on top of that, is adding a lot of value, the domestic value added to its exports, as you can see on chart 16 here. So you put this together, which is the opposite that you can see for Germany, where the value added is relatively high, but coming down. This is the dot in violet. You can see the difference. It's like the reduction, if we can define globalization by the global size of the value chain, which is shrinking, a lot of the action is coming from China's vertical integration, which is not followed by other countries, especially Europe. And that's the key message I want to give. On the tech side of things, I just want to focus on trade data, basically, which is export controls. And you can see there very clearly that this is not so much a global issue. It's not a globalization, it's a decoupling issue. So when we talk about globalization or trends, I think we need to distinguish between those that are pushed by decoupling and those that are actually general trends. Yeah. So for trade, I think we need to realize that, yes, a lot of action is happening because of China's vertical integration. But let me tell you, this type of integration is happening in India too, at a different level, but it's happening too when you look at input-output data. So it's not only a China story. However, for tech, it's a China story. Or put it this way, it's a US story, because it's the US clearly reducing export licenses to China, but not to the rest of the world. So these two different kind of types, if I may say, of factors behind globalization: China-driven, or US-China basically driven because of strategic competition, or more general trends. On people-to-people globalization, I also think, just by looking at the number of passengers, we're not yet back to where we were before COVID. And you can see that of course, the bottleneck, if I may say, the reason why we're not back is Asia, but most importantly, China, and this is zero COVID policies. Now you may say, well, this is just temporary. Maybe temporary, but maybe not. The reality is that it's already 3 years and we're not back to where we were, let alone the growth that we've missed. So it's hard to think of a world that continues to globalize if there is such a restriction, in people's mobility, because it has enormous consequences on exchanges, whether it's education exchanges, research exchanges, etc. So I do think this is quite important to focus on when talking about at least globalization. Then on FDI, although we had somehow of a peak or at least, an upward or an increase simply in 2021, The data for 2022 is not yet very appealing, at least when I use M&A data. And this means that indeed there's also a trend, maybe not as clear as with value chains, but there is a trend for reduced integration in terms of foreign direct investment. I think this is very worrisome, as you can imagine, for global growth. Then on financial decoupling beyond FDI, I actually think that these graphs do tell a story, because, and this is again decoupling. So I don't think we are deglobalizing financially. Forget about FDI for a moment. FDI, of course, is a small amount of total flows, financial flows. But when you look at financial flows, so portfolio flows, and you look at China and the US, I think things are happening, and we should not forget this. One is China's holdings of US treasuries. Of course, this is just one part of the holdings. We all know that China holds US treasuries through, offshore centers, Luxembourg, you name it. We don't know what's happening there, but the trend to me is clear enough to basically indicate that this might be perhaps fear of sanctions. I mean, there's many reasons for this, but it happened even before we talked about sanctions. So, there's more than that. But on the US side of things, this is dramatic. This has started only recently, basically since 2022. And this is the massive and rapid decrease in US holdings of Chinese long-term securities. And you can say you can see that overall, the share of foreign ownership in China's bond market has really been coming down since the peak at the end of 2021. So there is a story here. I mean, some people say it's only, because interest rate differential. I actually think that there's many other things playing out. First, of course, the difficulties, if you think on the Chinese side for listings in the US, but on the US side, sanctions, I mean, you basically, as a US national, cannot hold a number of of Chinese corporate names without being targeted, and this is this so-called PLA-related company list, and therefore I do think that this is something that down the road, and given what this was before Ukraine, by the way, it's just that the fear of, say, the shadow of Ukraine over Taiwan and beyond is what is, to me, driving these forces for financial, if not full decoupling, at least reduction of the coupling, if I may say, of the tight coupling. So in conclusion, I do think there is signs, to start with the last sentence, that we are in a globalization trend. And it's not only about trade, it's more general. I think we can see that in tech, we can see that in people to people, we can see that in finance. And a part of that is just general trends, as I said, value chains, perhaps, value chain resilience, fear of too long a distance, natural disasters. I mean, you can think of things that are not China-driven, but there are, of course, some that are China-driven. First, China's vertical integration, quest for self-reliance. Secondly, US-led trade export controls on the tech side, international people-to-people flow, especially Asia and mostly China. And then, again, this fear of sanctions, I think, driving part of the US-China financial decoupling, which are important down the road. I don't think all of these things are just temporary, if you ask me. I mean, some of them might be more temporary than others, but if you look at it as a basket of things happening, I think I'm comfortable to say that I do see that globalization trends hitting the global economy at the moment. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia. This is really very interesting. I liked a lot of the part on financial integration and the new trends in financial integration. I looked at the data and I actually came up with similar conclusions when we go beyond FDI. So maybe we will have the time to follow up on this. But first, I would like to move to Alexander. Alexander, as I mentioned earlier, you have done some work on decoupling, which was mentioned several times. So maybe you can now show us some evidence.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here, and thanks also to the three previous speakers who kind of sorry. So to the previous speakers, because basically you did my introduction. That's a bit kind of lowering your impact. That's why I didn't want to phrase it that way. But basically it made things sort of easier because you were talking about the globalization, the trends for deglobalization in general, that we already see tendencies of a general decoupling, be it a general decoupling or a decoupling of parties. I like this phrasing of forming gangs. And the question is, what does all this mean, right? What does all this mean from the point of developments in real income? What does this mean from a point of welfare? And so, I mean, I've written down here as the motivation for the research that we're doing at the Kiel Institute, two challenges to globalization, but of course, these are only the recent ones. So we've seen this trend already of deglobalizing to an extent. We've seen this trend in growing skepticism of the political West towards China. But then this has been kind of triggered again by the two recent crises that we experienced, which is, of course, first of all, the COVID pandemic and then the war in Ukraine. So let me be very fast on this because I'm already the fourth talk today. So we had this extreme recession following the COVID pandemic. GDP in the European Union alone went down by 5.9% in 2020. Everything then seemed to be better in 2021, but then of course we had the war in Ukraine, or we still have it, unfortunately, and that is now bringing into the attention the question of sustainable energy supplies, raw materials, food. Fortunately, not in Europe, but in many other regions of the world, this is becoming a problem. Now, I'm highlighting here three consequences. There are, of course, many more. The first one is the one that we talked about already. A lot global supply chains were disrupted, different kinds of products being affected in different years. But the story holds that supply chains turn out not to be as sustainable, as resilient as we thought they would be. Accompanied by that is, of course, this return of inflation, which already happened before the Ukrainian war. I think that's very important to see that we've had this return of higher consumer prices already in 2021, but then, of course, an entirely different story right now this year, driven by high energy prices in particular. And then, of course, thinking ahead, we have this high level of uncertainty regarding future supply chains. Now, what are the implications? So this brings me back to the previous talks. Is this general desire to, or there seems to be a general desire, at least, to decouple, to become independent from other countries, in particular, of course, these days from Russia, right? But also from the story that's being told that a supply problem on the other side of the world can cause serious disruption in your own production, and we want to avoid this. And this is kind of fueling the skepticism of globalization that we've already seen over the past few years, way before the two crises. And this is particularly true. We've also talked about this already when it comes to skepticism vis-a-vis China. Now, the proposed solution is this decoupling that we've mentioned several times, and reshoring to become resilient. And the question that we want to answer is, how would such a decoupling impact welfare, i.e. real income, in both the European Union, but also its trading partners? So I want to be extremely brief, just to give you one slide on recent developments of EU trade, in particular with China, just to kind of set the scene, and then already delve into answering the question of what are the impacts of reshoring value chains back to Europe, bringing the production back to Europe. What would be the impacts of this on welfare in Europe? So what you can see here now is kind of a longer trend, just the impact of, or the development of of EU28 trade with China in light blue, and with the entire world in dark blue. These are EU28 exports. And the only thing that I want to show you here is what you already all know, is that exports, particularly to China, have increased quite dramatically up until the eve of the pandemic. So to give you a number, average export growth to China was around 7%, and this compares to around 3% overall export growth to the entire world. And this means that China has become more important, both in absolute terms and in relative terms. So we're exporting more to China than we used to, but China is also a more important trading partner for the European Union than it used to be. And just to give you a few numbers here, so in 2019, 11% of EU28 exports went to China, and this compares to only 8% in 2010. My screen was black there for a second, but I assume you can still see everything. Yes, thank you. So certainly China becoming more important as an export market, as a destination market for European products. And the same goes for the import side. Here it's less visible from the graph, but again, we have the stronger import growth from China relative to overall imports. And here the numbers are even more striking. So in 2019, before the pandemic, 20% of EU imports originated in China, compared to 18% in 2010. Now, of course, this excludes intra-EU trade, and these are only kind of the direct trade. So it ignores the input-output linkages, but it gives you an idea of the very strong interdependence that we have here. Now, the question is, of course, what do such dependencies mean if we decide to change everything and to say, okay, we now do everything ourselves? That's what we simulated with the general equilibrium trade model. So we call this the Kiel Institute Trade Policy Evaluation Model, because it has the fancy abbreviation KITE. And it's basically a relatively standard trade model, general equilibrium trade model, which allows us to simulate trade flows between around 140 countries in 65 sectors. And what we do is, in the model, we double the European Union's trade barriers with respect to third countries. So trade within the EU remains unaffected. Only trade with non-EU countries is affected, and see what happens to trade, but more importantly, of course, to real income. And I want to present to you 4 scenarios. The first one is a unilateral decoupling of the European Union. So the European Union restricting its imports, doubling its import barriers under the assumption that, we don't mind exporting to other countries, but we just want to become less reliant when it comes to imports. The second is then a mutual decoupling, meaning that the exports are also restricted explicitly. This could be done either by the European Union, think about exports to Russia, right, where we restrict our exports, but this could also be done by our trading partners, because they say, well, if you stop importing from us, we will stop importing from you as well. That's why we call it a trade war. And then we've got kind of maybe the more likely scenario. So Simon mentioned this when you talked about ganging up or teaming up, decoupling just from certain regions, in particular decoupling from China, that's scenario 3, and decoupling from Russia, that would be scenario 4. And in particular, in the case of Russia, we would expect the EU not to do it alone. We would expect what we actually are seeing already. So we ran the simulations last year, I think, and beginning of this year. And now we're seeing this, of course, this decoupling between the EU, the US, and their allies on the one hand, and Russia on the other hand. So let me very briefly, just to kind of give you an idea of the mechanism here, tell you a bit about the trade effects for scenario 1. So this is this unilateral decoupling of the EU raising its barriers on imports. What happens? Well, not surprisingly, imports fall within the model, right? Imports from third countries fall by around 62%. So that's expected, right? That's kind of the aim of decoupling. However, somehow surprising, maybe exports fall by almost as much as imports. Now, what's the mechanism here? Well, I mean, we have this increase in import barriers. This means that production shifts back to Europe. That's exactly what we want, or that's kind of what is kind of the aim of this scenario. But then, of course, we didn't import from China just for fun, but because certain products could be produced more efficiently in China, in the US, in Vietnam. So what we do, if we produce these things ourselves, we can do that for many products, not for all of them, but for many we can produce them ourselves. But of course, we can't do it quite as efficiently. So we lose the advantages of international division of labor and specialization, meaning that we produce these goods ourselves, but at higher costs, right? So our products become more expensive, we lose competitiveness, and this explains this surprisingly strong impact on exports as well. And we have currency effects as well, but they go in the same direction. So what I can tell you from this already is this kind of decoupling works, but at the cost of exports as well, even if we only kind of officially want to reduce our import dependence. So, I mean, that's not the important question. The important question is, what does this do to welfare? What does this do to real income? And so what we show is that if we did this unilateral decoupling in the European Union, if we kind of reduced artificially increased import barriers, this would actually reduce real income by 3.5%, and this would be a permanent impact, right? So GDP, if you wish, I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar, would be every year would be 3.5% lower than in a world without these additional trade barriers. And of course, if we escalate and have this trade war, so this mutual decoupling, then the impact would be even stronger, so more than 5% loss in GDP. And of course, what this masks is a lot of heterogeneity across countries. So I've shown Germany here as Europe's largest economy. As we know, Germany is relatively open, so would be more strongly hit by export restrictions, 6.9% here. But in general, we can say that small open economies in Europe in particular would be hit hardest, but our trading partners would actually suffer as well. So in this scenario too, in this trade war scenario, on average, our trading partners, so US, China, and so on, would lose 1.5%. So this is kind of the no-brainer in a way. The conclusion here is that decoupling, when we purely think about income, harms everyone. Now, what about decoupling only from the countries that we currently deem politically problematic? So let's start with China. Same idea, mutually raising trade barriers. So we would almost have a complete elimination of imports, even stronger than this general decoupling, because it's of course easier to decouple from an individual country, even if it's as large as China is. We will see import diversion. We import more from other countries, Vietnam, Korea, and so on. And consequently, our income losses are smaller as well. So for the EU, it's only 0.8%. For Germany, it's 1%. China is exactly in between, 0.9%. How about Russia? So remember here, we have this idea that it's not only the EU, but it's also the US and their allies that decouple from Russia. More or less same trade effects. The interesting thing is here that the welfare effects for the US and its allies, including the EU and Germany, are much smaller on average than in this decoupling from China scenario, whereas the impact on Russia is extremely strong. So we have a 10% drop in real income here in this scenario for Russia. Why is that? Well, again, quite simple, because relative economic size matters, right? So China is of course more important a trading partner for Germany than Russia is, right? Explaining just these difference here in effects. Whereas on the other hand, the EU, the US, and its allies are of course more important for Russia than only the EU is for China, which is also in itself a larger country, economically speaking. So that's explaining these extreme differences. And for the current, political struggles, this of course again fuels the argument that it of course makes sense to build coalitions, right, to search for partners when implementing sanctions. Again, that's intuitive to all of us. Once again, these aggregate figures hide heterogeneity. So when we think about the Russia scenario, in particular, Eastern European countries, Baltic states in particular, are strongly affected here. So we would have to think about compensating losers potentially when we have such policies, not only within countries, but also across countries. But, and I think that's an interesting point, is that that decoupling from Russia in particular is feasible in the long run. So that's extremely important. These are long run models, right? So when we think about energy trade, this means that we've built new LNG pipelines. We can construct new LNG pipelines, new LNG terminals and pipelines, gas pipelines, and make progress with the energy transition. So all these kind of things have taken place, and we are in a new equilibrium. So that's extremely important when we want to analyze what's costing us to become independent from individual countries. The short-term effects are of course stronger than the long-term effects. So what does this mean? So this reshoring of value chains becoming kind of moving almost back to autarky is a proposition that it's out there. We hope it's not completely realized, because it would probably make us less vulnerable to shocks in third countries, however, at the cost of lower living standards. So this is what these simulations have shown, right? I mean, this is a trade-off, I guess, but then there are other points that we can't show with the simulations, that this decoupling, when it's done, like, completely moving back to autarky, does not protect us against global shocks, because by definition, they're global. And in particular, it would make us more vulnerable to shocks in Europe. And I think that's something that's often being forgotten in the debate, that, of course, yes, currently the problem is with China, and maybe China is a more riskier country in a way than Germany is, but we can have floods in Germany, we can have French nuclear power plants breaking down, so there can be production shocks in Europe. And in these cases, we need trade as an insurance policy. And an interesting example, I think, is always the fertilizer industry. So this is actually a shock that comes from Russia, so it's not a perfect example. So we have the high gas prices, meaning that the fertilizer industry in Europe is more or less down, right? But fortunately, our farmers can still use fertilizer, buy fertilizer, because they buy it from countries with lower gas prices, such as the United States, right? So this is just an example how trade helps us to avoid these cascading effects that could ruin an economy. Yeah, so let me conclude. I mean, this is kind of what I've said in the previous slide, that this decoupling from individual countries, in particular from an economically small country such as Russia, is possible in the long run, right? So this is always the problem here. We have to think about the long run. In the medium term, in the short term, it's more costly. But a general decoupling is no solution, not only because of the higher costs it entails, but also because it actually increases risks and reduces resilience rather than increasing resilience. So the solution is something that is also not new. Many economists have advocated that in the context of COVID, in the context of the geopolitical struggles that we're currently having. It's diversification. So somehow encourage diversification of companies when it comes to their supply chains. And this can best be done, of course, by increasing international cooperation rather than by reducing it. And that's it from my side. A bit bumpy, but hopefully you got all the points. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Alexander. It was very interesting, and I think that the message is very clear. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A function, but please allow me to use my power as moderator to ask a couple of questions. I have a question for Simon and one for Alicia. Let me start with Simon. Simon, I think that your concern emerged quite clearly from the language that you used, and I have to say that your data were quite new to me, and I saw a chart which for me was quite a surprise. So when basically you showed other kind of barriers than usual tariff and quotas, I see the EU in an upward trend. So basically, if I understand correctly, this refers to some sort of trade subsidies, which have been increasing in the EU, if I understand correctly. This is over the last years. Now, how can it be? I mean, we have state aid policies. That kind of chart is something that for me doesn't square with the policies that should be in place.
So thanks for the question, and it perfectly illustrates why, when you're doing serious policy analysis, you must move beyond the narrative and mantras that tend to take place in capital cities and places like Brussels. You need to look at the hardline underlying facts. And when you do that, you'll see that there's a lot of subsidies being awarded by the European Investment Bank. We have regional development banks within the EU, like the Nordic Investment Bank. We have national development banks in France, Italy, and Germany, who are awarding lots of subsidies as well. And this is all before you get into pandemic response or anything like this. What we have also seen, and I think you'll find this if you talk to state aid experts, is essentially a progressive weakening of EU state aid rules since the global financial crisis, which has been capitalized upon by governments. The new threat, and one of the reasons why you're seeing that upward slope, is that the green agenda, the climate agenda, which is a noble goal, has been used and hijacked for the purposes of awarding subsidies left, right, and center to different companies. And if you look at our database for this year, you'll see an enormous number of European subsidies being awarded by some countries. So the fact is, the EU state aid regime probably offers some restraint on what member states are doing, but it is diminishing in terms of its power of restraint. And I think there needs to be a reset in the language in Brussels and in the European Union about subsidies towards one which is a lot more evidence-based. The EU has a lot of subsidies, and it's not just in agriculture.
Thanks a lot for the clarification. If you allow me, I have also another question. You mentioned gangs. Who are the gangs? I mean, in the description of the conference, we put forward the idea of two potential blocks. Mm-hmm. Are these the potential gangs, or you see more variable geometry in countries pulling forces, join forces together for like a common goal?
I frequently get asked this question. I think the gangs or the blocks will be very fuzzy. There will be some core members. For that would be, say, the United States, Australia, United Kingdom, possibly the European Union on one side. And then there will be a lot of countries which are possibly straddling or on the borderline of that camp and straddling others. So think about countries like Switzerland and Vietnam, who have ties to both China as well as to the West. And so I think this is going to be quite fuzzy and murky. By the way, much as it was during the Cold War as well. I mean, there were some hard lines, but there was still quite a number of countries which were who were straddling. And I think that is what we will see. And I think this is going to open some very interesting possibilities for foreign direct investment alike. For investment in countries which are straddling these two camps may actually benefit at the expense of those who are inside these camps.
Thanks a lot. Many thanks. I would like now to ask a question to Alicia. You mentioned the potential impact of the sanctions. I also believe that one specific sanction, which was freezing assets, reserve assets, actually was sort of wake-up call for many countries, whereby US dollar is an international currency, but maybe it's not common good, is actually under the ultimate control of the issuer of the currency. And then my question is, so we could expect some countries exiting from the dollar. My question is, to what extent this is possible on a large scale? If I think of all the reserves that China owns, if it gets out of the US dollar, where can it go? Sorry, maybe a difficult question, but I think it's quite important.
Indeed, thanks for the question. Well, I mean, put it this way, ultimately, China's, I wouldn't say dream, because anything can happen, but aspiration is to remimbi-size, if I may say, its foreign assets. This is the US, basically, yeah. And the problem is that for China to be able to do that, China needs to have a much bigger external debt, because that's the only way to promote the use of to basically nominate your liabilities in your own currency. Yeah. So it has a kind of a problem of at the core of it, which is that it's a net creditor, even if not as big as Japan, but still. Now, so this is in net terms, basically. Now, gross terms, the reserves, which is a smaller kind of argument. The problem is that with Ukraine, China has learned that it's not about the dollar, it's about the euro, it's about the yen, it's about the British pound, it's about any G7 country currency, yeah, and perhaps even beyond, because imagine they just expand to, I don't know, Aussie dollar. Maybe that doesn't help. What about Mexican dollar? I mean, I know that the SAFE actually granted the holdings of Mexican peso many years ago, I think 2015 or 14, 13 maybe, I can't remember, but nearly 8-9 years ago already. And this was well before we would talk about sanctions on foreign reserves, because the idea was always that there was excessive dependence on the dollar. This is a very kind of well entrenched concept in China. So I would not argue that everything we're seeing, I mean, of course, the acceleration indeed, but the trend I think was already there. That the difference though is that now the number of safe currencies is so small, and they're not in any way international currencies. So that's I think the key issue. Then of course, before Ukraine, China also tried to diversify away by acquiring assets rather than holding currency or safe assets in foreign currencies. This is the idea of China's outbound strategy. But we've learned that even those assets could be at risk. Yeah, they could be somehow nationalized or simply, so it's not a solution either. So I think China is trapped in this reality that unless it becomes a debtor like the US and can use its own currency, there's no way it can diversify away all of these US dollar related assets. So yeah, I don't think there is a response to that. I just want to say, if you allow me, on these issues of subsidies, if I may, because I've worked quite a lot on Chinese subsidies, and I know Simon's work, and we just saw the graph that China's subsidies have gone up, and Europe and US kind of more stagnant, but still in essence similar size. Of course, China is bigger, but not so much bigger. Well, I just want to say that as we might all realize, that's only part of the subsidies that for the Chinese economy. We worked on those numbers, which are basically based on financial statements. By the way, a lot of those subsidies are Hong Kong based, so you need to look offshore as well. But beyond that, you need to look at a tax, basically lower effective tax ratio, lower interest rates offered by policy and state-owned commercial banks to Chinese companies. So the amount of subsidies is much more pervasive and harder to measure in China's size. So just to say that, I'm not sure whether, I mean, our subsidies may be very big. I'm nobody to judge on that, because it's a normative statement. But I can bet Chinese subsidies are much bigger, because they just go beyond the actual measurement of subsidies that we can never come up with. That's all.
Thanks a lot, Alicia. Let me now move to the questions which are in the Q&A. I think, Simon, you maybe started to write an answer, or probably you already wrote an answer. I'm not sure people can see it. Maybe can you quickly address it, please?
Absolutely. So there was a question to me about how do we build more resilient supply chains, and an unsurprising question given the context of the last few years. I think if by resilience we mean supply chains which have a lower probability of either being disrupted or for long periods of disruption, then I think it is really a matter of identifying the underlying risks. And it's not clear to me that the risks in a supply chain are any lower if you source from friends rather than from non-friends. And so I find this sort of friend-shoring leads to resilient supply chain narrative a little bit unconvincing. I can tell you, and since I teach at a leading business school, that the corporate executives that I deal with are very attentive now to the questions of risks of supply chain disruption, because of course any such disruptions result in revenue losses for them, or revenue disruption. And so this matter is now receiving a lot more corporate attention. And that means for public policymakers they have to answer the following question. What flaw in private sector decision-making do they think public policy can or needs to address? And then they need to ask if they have a tool which will address that flaw. And I must tell you, I rarely hear officials or politicians answering that question, because that is the question one should ask in trying to design policy here. Where is the private sector screwing up? And there are now some economic analyses that argue that there are very few simplistic answers to that question. And again, this is a good example of how the sort of narrative is detached from the underlying careful analysis which needs to be done for important questions such as this one.
Many thanks. Alexander.
If I can maybe add to this. So when it comes to diversifying to increase resilience, I would absolutely agree with Simon that we have to maybe look beyond our friends as well. It would be really nice if we could just rely only on our friends, but there are risks as well in politically friendly countries. So I've just given these examples of the French nuclear power plants or the German floods, but there are many more, of course. And the other thing is, of course, that we think about the types of resources that we need, right? They are not all in friendly countries. And this is just a reality that we need to confront ourselves with. We've seen this with Russia now, with energy. Of course, there is gas elsewhere, but when you think about the countries that have gas, a lot of them aren't those that have exactly the same moral standards and political system as we do. And we have to ask ourselves very clearly and honestly how to deal with these countries. And I think this is just something that we need to talk about in public and think about the conflicting policy goals that we clearly have. So we want resilience, we want energy security, we want climate change. We want to stop climate change, meaning that we want to make progress with our energy transition, but we also want to stand up for human rights, for example, or to make sure that our supply chains are clean, like actually clean when it comes to CO2 production, but also clean when it comes to human rights. And these are things that sometimes are hard to achieve jointly, and we have to work on this, yes, but we have to ask ourselves, when we have these conflicts, what do we do with them? And I'm thinking of the due diligence legislation that we have that's coming in Germany, that is being discussed at the EU level, which I think is a great step towards standing up for human rights. But there is a but. The question is, how does this impact our goal to become more resilient? And this is something that we need to discuss openly.
These are very important trade-offs that sometimes are not fully addressed in the policy debate. There are two questions which are related to climate issues. I would like to put them on the table. So the first question is, okay, some of the trends that we are seeing are somehow negative, have been presented as negative. The question is the following: given the need to fight climate change, can they be seen as encouraging? I mean, this maybe leads to what Simon said earlier, and the fact that maybe some of these subsidies are related to climate change, against climate change policies. And the second one, which may be related, is more specific, and it's on the CBAM, so on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and to what extent such a tax actually could impact the figures that we saw. Simon?
So two separate questions. Let me take one each in turn. The policy calculus associated with subsidies with a climate change dimension is, that's a quite difficult question, because one has to balance the market distortion and the market access reduction to trading partners against the climate change benefit, or a purported climate change benefit. And I haven't seen yet a particularly well thought through calculus which essentially assures Europe's trading partners that the current patterns of subsidization we're seeing on climate change grounds is being driven by net welfare improving methods. And so I think that is a very important challenge, but it's not just a European Union challenge. The US is using climate change subsidies as well now. As far as CBAMs is concerned, I would even broaden the discussion to say that increasingly we're seeing a series of regulations which are being used essentially to influence the form of cross-border supply chains. And these regulations are relatively nascent. Perhaps in the area of deforestation, they're actually quite well developed. And these, I think, threaten a very serious rupture between Europe and some of its trading partners. And I think it would be unwise for people in Brussels to underestimate the level of concern in some developing countries about these regulations and where they're going. And these are countries which are normally quite sympathetic to the EU. So that's what I pick up when I go to Geneva to talk to delegations there. And so I think this is an area where we need to think carefully about the extent to which the European Union and other countries want to weaponize supply chains, because that's how it will be perceived. And so this is an area of considerable concern also to the business community, who finds, at least as they tell me, these regulations to be horribly intransparent. So there's a lot of work there, I think, that European Union officials need to do to build confidence of both the private sector as well as foreign trading partners.
Thanks a lot. There is a question where basically there is a policy proposal. So the question is, do you think that supporting national business and investors abroad, so like aggressive coupling instead of having government to support domestic industry, could be a good policy, so something that is desirable? Anyone would like to take it? Maybe in my reading it was not very clear. Maybe I just follow more closely the text of the question. So apart from government supporting the domestic industries, do you also see them supporting national businesses and investors abroad, which would present distortion by a type of aggressive coupling of certain bonds rather than decoupling or reshoring? Maybe it's not...
I mean, so we're not talking about FDI here, right? FDI here, foreign direct investment, or, I mean, because this is something, of course, one can or cannot encourage. And that, I mean, that's what we're seeing. So when we think about FDI, of course, that we're seeing when it comes to China, which is pursuing, well, as many people would argue, some people would argue, quite an relatively aggressive acquisition strategy. But I don't think that this is what the question is about. So
I think it's more, Alicia?
No, maybe I don't fully understand the question, but perhaps it's a good opportunity. Hopefully I give some answer to the question, maybe not exactly perhaps what is being asked, but I want to say that the way we are discussing about decoupling, first of all, I didn't make any normative comment as to whether this is good or bad. But Alexander, in a way, if maybe I'm misreading your comments, but was very much of the like of this might be a bad thing for, and I kind of agree with that. But I want to say that in some specific cases, going back to this question, decoupling might be based on an economic rationale, not only on a geopolitical rationale. Or maybe not decoupling, that's not the right word, reshoring or nearshoring, or reshuffling basically the value chain, maybe decoupling as such, because it goes beyond a company's decision, is perhaps not a rational proposition altogether. But I think at the company level, there may be occasions for reshuffling to be a better choice beyond the political push that may be behind, that could seemingly be behind that movement, but there may be just simply. So to that point, if that's the case, there's no need to support, there's no need to subsidize, there's no need to do anything about it, because companies will understand when and how that reshuffling is welcome, or it's more efficient. This could be linked to climate change issues, cost of energy, many things, new regulations, I mean, you name it. And it doesn't have to be only about US-China strategic competition. Maybe not. So that's all I wanted to add, that maybe that subsidization that the question was referring to might not even be necessary if this is a rational, economic rational, there is a economic rationale behind, that's all.
Thanks a lot for your help. I would like to go ahead with questions. So that there is one which is directly addressed to Alexander. And it's basically about your results. So decoupling leads to smaller GDP for all countries according to common sense in economics and models. Is there any model scenario where autarky leads to the same welfare as before? This basically follow up also on the keynote speech where it was highlighted that in some cases, some sovereignty, food sovereignty actually could be defeatable.
So, I mean, first thing is that these are trade models, right? So the only thing that we're looking at is trade, not investment or financial flows, at least not directly. And that's something that I think one has to mention because mechanisms might be different in these different areas. So the simple answer is no, not that I'm aware of. Autarky is in these models is never welfare maximizing or real income maximizing, if you wish. But of course, you know, real income is not the only thing that matters, right? So resilience matters as well. We've talked about this, and different models come to different conclusions. Some depending on the kind of shock that you're modeling. So if it's kind of a specific lockdown in China, then of course, if you're if Europe is in autarky, it's less strongly affected by such an income shock. So it's more resilient in a sense. However, the ex ante kind of, or the welfare loss from decoupling, right, from the welfare from being in such a deglobalized world is so much lower than the welfare from being in a globalized world, that even when you have the shock in the globalized world, the welfare or the income is still higher in Europe than when you have the deglobalized world in Europe, and then you're insulated from the shock. And there are other models that even, I think from the OECD as well, that even show that, you know, as I said, depends on how this production shock is modeled. That still, because of this, think about this trade as insurance, because you can then quickly, ideally at least, adjust your trading partners. Then even the shock might be actually smaller in a globalized world. So yeah, so it depends a bit on the modeling assumption, but long story short, if you incorporate both this level effect from decoupling and then this how does the shock act, then typically living in a globalized world is the welfare enhancing solution. What this does not tell us is about the geopolitical risks and how the kind of the game theoretic modeling here would be incorporated. So can China pressure us in, just to give an example here, in doing certain things? Can Putin pressure us in doing certain things because we're dependent? So this is not explicitly modeled. So this is something that we have to think about separately.
Thanks a lot. Maybe one last question. There are still several, but there was one for Alicia. It was basically a follow-up on the point that you made that for China, for the renminbi to replace the dollar, somehow China needs to issue liabilities. So the question is this worthwhile to become a debtor instead of being a creditor in order to move in this direction?
Well, I mean, the case of Japan speaks for itself. I mean, Japan also tried to internationalize the yen, and you know the way to do it was at the beginning samurai bonds, and have others you basically leverage on the yen to use the yen to borrow, yeah, because Japan, of course, is a large net creditor, and the issuance of its own liabilities, JGBs, is held by Japanese over 91%. So, but it didn't work because, you know, to get to that depth, I mean, you can get somewhere, but you cannot get to become, in my opinion, the reserve currency of the world. It depends on your objective. If you just want to internationalize the renminbi, I don't know, like, get, I don't know, 3% of global payments or maybe 5%, that's okay. But if you want to do much more than that, especially on the investment borrowing side of a reserve currency, I think it's very difficult. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. So we have reached the end of this session. I will not even try to summarize what has been said, just to complicate it. It has been extremely enlightening. I really learned a lot. So many thanks to all. I hope all the people in the audience also appreciate it. We have now 14 minutes break. Please stay with us. There is a new session focusing on the geopolitics of de-globalization, just following, where the focus will be more on foreign policy aspects and geoeconomics. And have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
I say that as we have the privilege of being in the second session and the participants are waiting for us already, we can begin. Good afternoon. My name is Ekaterina Springer. I'm Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Intereconomics, Review of European Economic Policy. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's second session, the Geopolitics of De-globalization. We have an hour and 15 minutes, although obviously that's a topic we could spend an entire day on. We will have 3 presentations followed by a question and answer session at the end of this panel. We will take questions from the audience via the Q&A function in Zoom, so please type your questions below. The coronavirus pandemic demonstrated the vulnerabilities of long supply chains and made countries look closer to home. Russia's war in Ukraine has further brought to light the benefits of self-reliance, be it in food, energy, critical raw materials, and medical goods. It also highlighted that economic ties can be a cause of weakness rather than strength. Today, the world's great economic powers are focused more than ever on limiting their economic dependencies. The EU is striving for strategic autonomy. The United States is focused on limiting supply chain risks. China is shifting towards dual circulation in order to reduce the role of foreign trade in its economy. And since all of this is taking place in the context of economic interdependence and strategic competition, especially between the United States and China, geo-economic policies play an increasingly prominent role. It does seem now inevitable that integration will decrease. Are we witnessing the end of globalization? Is multipolar worlds with dispersed power a realistic scenario, or perhaps even a smarter model for the future? In this session, we want to take a closer look at the changing global geopolitical landscape. We want to better understand what it means for the European Union's role in the world, and we want to assess the risks Europe faces in the changing world. Let me briefly introduce our speakers in order of their appearance. Isabel Ioannidis is a senior policy analyst working on the evaluation of EU external action at the European Parliament's Research Service. She's also a research associate at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. Her research lies within peace building and EU foreign and security policy. Our second speaker will be Simone Urbani-Grechi. He is head of international strategic analysis at Intesa Sanpaolo, a leading banking group. His recent book, Geopolitics and Us, looks at some practical keys to understanding today's geopolitics. Our last speaker, Benjamin Zisimas, is an associate professor of economics at the University of Exeter Business School. His research focuses on institutions, trade, and economic development. Now, without further ado, let me welcome Isabel. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Katerina, and thank you so much to Intereconomics and SEPS for this invitation to what has been so far a very topical discussion. I'm a political scientist, so I will be looking at things from quite a different perspective, and hopefully maybe tying back to some of what Jayati Ghosh has said, because she was the only one who actually explicitly mentioned politics and institutions. As someone who, works in an institution, and I have to make sure it's clear that I'm talking in my own personal voice here today, but I think maybe I have some insight, but as Simon noted, maybe also some blind spots. So we'll see what comes out from my presentation. I would say that today the EU would have a hard time talking about deglobalization because trade has been one of its strongest instruments, and after a period of relative standstill during COVID-19, it's now relaunching many of its trade negotiations, and despite the war in Ukraine and a looming recession, it's hoping to continue with this instrument, and it's obviously been committed to what it's called effective multilateralism since 2003. So in a way, it's been unable to see this emerging dichotomy between a world of competition and cooperation as an especially acute challenge. I'm not sure it was able to predict it well. But having said that, I think it has managed to identify some of the weaknesses of the system, and as a result also maybe is beginning to react to those. So I would mention 4 to those: geopolitical influences in what I would say is more a world in transition rather than a deglobalized world. First, the ascent of authoritarianism in Europe and across the world. So if we look at, for example, the latest democracy index, we see that only 6.4% of the world population lives in full democracies. That's 21 countries, while almost 40% of them live in flawed democracies, which is 53 countries, and 17% in hybrid regimes, which is 34 countries. And that more than a third of the world population, 37%, live in authoritarian regimes, which is 59 countries. And all the indicators have declined significantly since the 2020 edition of the Democracy Index. So this is not new. And of course, we know that this situation is not only something that we see abroad, but we see it in the EU's aspiring members, so in the Western Balkans, but also in EU member states themselves. We've seen worrisome perspectives about the victory of Giorgia Meloni, the leader of the right-wing Brothers of Italy party, and also the rise of the radical right in Sweden, which has served to illustrate trends that are evident in Western democracies over the recent decades. But I would say that while the radical right is gaining ground in the EU member states, apart from Hungary, they don't seem to have effective power, and that when they're in coalitions in the executive, there can still be a vibrant opposition, a vibrant civil society, and they're not very effective. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be vigilant. Then a second issue is the systemic rivalry. So I mean, I don't think I need to explain our relationship with Russia since Russia's aggression against Ukraine. With China, it's been more complicated because in 2019, there was a strategy where, you know, China was defined, let's say, as a potential partner, competitor, or rival, but probably now with China having become an even stronger global competitor to the EU, that systemic rivalry is gaining some momentum, and maybe that formula would need to be replaced by more of a competitor, rival, partner formula instead. And thirdly, we've seen the hybrid wars. So, and within that, I would say, obviously, there's the backlash of technology, disinformation wars against states and non-state entities, as well as online smearing against human rights defenders, for example, democracy workers. And we even see today with what's happening in North Kosovo, which is clearly being fueled by nationalist rhetoric from Belgrade, but also Russian disinformation, and has potential dangers of leading to even secessionist moods in Kosovo. Then there's been the weaponization of energy. Prosperity was based on China and Russia in terms of market and energy. Russia was the leading supplier of the main fossil fuels to the EU, oil, gas, coal, in the past 10 years or so. And the EU was Russia's top energy client in 2021. We've seen shortages also in gold, silver, minerals that have affected industrial sectors such as batteries, electronics, the automotive and machinery sectors. And then there's obviously been the geopolitics of food, because Russia and Ukraine provided over a third of the global wheat, maize, and sunflower exports before Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And they have posed a risk for food crisis in fragile, poor, and vulnerable countries, and obviously exacerbated global inflation. And Ukraine has been a key producer and exporter of wheat and maize, and some of approximately 90% of the wheat exports went to Africa and Asia between 2016 and 2021. And so there's a real food security situation, essentially in these disadvantaged regions of the world. And while the European Commission has using its instruments to bring some solutions, it established these solidarity lanes, which have been quite effective. Actually, when we look at the political level, aside from making statements at the UN Security Council and other international fora, it's been quite limited, the role that it's been able to play in crafting an agreement on the wheat deal. And I think these two last aspects that I spoke about show how geoeconomics have been instrumentalized and have become ramifications of geopolitics rather. So geopolitics is kind of running and influencing geoeconomics, while before, during the global financial crisis, I would say that it was rather the geoeconomics that were affecting more the geopolitics. And fourthly, and lastly, as I would say, the climate crisis, which of course the climate crisis is not a new crisis. We've seen it affecting Africa for at least the past 20 years. But what has changed is that we've seen that it's affecting us and EU citizens. And therefore it's increasingly being put on the EU agenda because it's affecting us, notwithstanding the fact that a new report from the World Meteorological Organization has found a disconcerting trend that actually Europe is warming up faster than expected, and that it will reach an overall average of 2.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So that's above the 1.5 degree that was set as a limit by the climate community. So what does this mean for Europe? Is Europe's coming of age actually coming? And I'm borrowing the phrase from Lucas Tsoukalis' latest book, where he looks at this issue, whether Europe is becoming an adult. And I would say the short answer is probably not, because I see a very complex world manifesting itself. So I've mentioned that on the one hand, you have the geopolitics that have overtaken the geoeconomics. And I think it's something that was also mentioned by Professor Ghosh. But there's also something that you mentioned in your introduction, which is whether there's a new Cold War being installed between the United States and China. Europe therefore finds itself again in a world of great power competition, and it will need to find a way to manage its relationship with China, but in a situation where the US and especially NATO are fundamental partners and necessary partners. But then there's this third level of a strong polarized multipolarity, and I think this has become quite obvious in the Yunga resolutions on Ukraine. Even before the launch of Russia's war, the corona crisis had accelerated these pre-existing trends. And they had already shown that there would be a more competitive and less secure international geopolitical environment. But what's interesting to see in this third level of governance, I think, is that it leads to an age of unpredictability, because we see that all these poles behave either in a very different way, depending on the situation that they are faced with. So sometimes they can be constructive, but other times they can be neutral. And we've seen that especially in the Ukraine war. So I think all this reminds us very much of Trina Flockhart's multi-order world, she conceived of the coming of an international system that consists of different orders or international societies that are nested within an overall international system. And this coming multi-order world, which she actually coined in 2016, she said that the liberal order would continue. It maybe would even be strengthened internally, but its global reach would be a thing of the past. And that in parallel, you would have a world where you would be forging new forms of relationships between composite and diverse actors across complex lines of division and conversion. And I think it's a brilliant idea. I think we're really headed towards that. And that's not very compatible with the world that the EU has built for itself, because it's a world that functions and has been built for times of peace, of multilateralism. It's compromise driven, and that world doesn't exist anymore. We see a world that's about hardcore geopolitics. And so in this configuration, the EU cannot be preoccupied with shaping the world to its model as it has been so far, but more about saving its model. And in those terms, I think the European model is at risk. So it will need to use all of its strengths, its trade, its single market, its regulatory framework, and the standards that it has set to try and get what it needs from the global scene. But at the same time, I have to say that crisis is an instigator for change, and this is exactly how the EU institutions have evolved, by adapting to crisis. And so I think, you know, I'm not sure President von der Leyen, when she called her commission geopolitical, she realized just how geopolitical it would be, because today we really do see the institutional shortcomings of the EU, which are mostly due to its unique nature of being, you know, sitting uneasily between being a supranational entity and an IO, but not an IO more than an international organization. I think today we've seen the EU's nature revealing its limits, namely because of the arbitrary and political nature of consensus. And maybe that's something to look at in more detail. Then Russia's war on Ukraine has also stimulated serious reflection on the instruments and the tools that we have to safeguard peace in times of contestation, which is not something new, obviously. But at the same time, there's a realization that the EU needs to go beyond this instrument-driven approach, that it really needs to become autonomous and a strategic actor. And a third thing, I think that's an instigator for change, is that in this avalanche of crisis that Europe has faced and that the world has faced, it has created circumstances where our leaders cannot hide and cannot avoid or disregard the realities that are facing us. They're just too tremendous, and also they can't hide them from the voters. So I think the ingredients are there for a transformative moment for Europe, and it needs to have this moment. So what can be done? And that's my last part. Boost European sovereignty. It's something that has mainly come from the member states, I would say, rather than the Commission itself. I think we've seen the limits of the soft power model. Now we really need to concentrate on building, you know, harder tools and a real autonomy, moving beyond just military gaps, maybe also looking at intelligence. What strategic actor doesn't have its own intelligence? For example, if we look at the situation in Ukraine, the EU is heavily dependent on US intelligence in this war. it was also one of our limits during and during our participation and our peace building efforts in the Sahel, especially when France was there. One of the things that was really missing in the EU efforts was our own intelligence. And at the same time, and secondly, I would say the EU cannot afford to vacillate between the US and China. At the same time, it will need to create a more symmetrical relationship with the United States. And this is also why European sovereignty is going to be very important. Ironically, today we have the midterm elections in the US, and if things change in Congress, we won't be able to take for granted anymore the excellent relationship we have with the United States. But at the same time, this divide, we see it today increasingly in trade between the EU and the US, especially when it comes to their Inflation Reduction Act, which was clearly aiming to boost the US industrial base. And it is a great domestic win for Biden, but has upset many of its US partners, not just the EU, but Japan, South Korea, Canada. And I wonder if there wasn't the war in Ukraine today, whether we wouldn't be discussing this at the WTO level. So of course, there's the task force that's able to deal with the potential disputes. But given that the act is coming from Congress, where the Balance Act was extremely difficult, domestically, the issue is really sensitive. I don't think it will be that easy to resolve, but at the same time, since there is the Ukraine war ongoing, I think the West will ultimately want to show that it has a united front on the global scene. And then a last point would be that, Europe and the EU is built on consensus and on compromises, in peace and moderation and negotiation. And maybe this is something that it can take to the global level. Maybe this is the added value it can bring as a player on the global scene. But to do that, it really needs to return to consolidating its EU values and protecting internally its model. So even if it can't export it anymore, this value based on democracy and diversity is going to be important internally to build consensus and a clear vision for its external action. And I would say that regardless of the recent divides we've seen and spats between France and Germany regarding economic sovereignty and strategic sovereignty, I think those disputes are not long-term because they cannot afford, Europe cannot afford to have them as long-term disputes. So in conclusion, I would say that it will really be key for the EU to ensure that it doesn't become a geopolitical backyard and retain its action at a global level. And it will depend on how well it manages to deal with risks and uncertainties, which I think this is something that in the business community is considered more as an opportunity, but in politics, it's extremely difficult to handle. But the consequences of not being able to, have more foresight and more preparedness for what's coming could be, without wanting to be alarmist, could put the EU more at a regional level rather at the level of a global player.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you very much for many ideas we can elaborate on during our later discussion session. Thank you. We will now move to the second presentation. Simone, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ekaterina. Hello, everyone. Many thanks to the Center for European Policy Studies and the Leibniz Information Center for Economics. It's great to be here today. Just a quick reminder before I start, the remarks that I will make today are entirely my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of my employer. I must say from the get-go that I really enjoyed the way you have packed so many thought-provoking questions in the abstract for this session. So I decided to make reference to those as I go along in my speech. As per the first aspect, there surely are tensions and competition between the US and China. However, in order to understand the geopolitical impact, let's not forget that these two countries appear inextricably connected in terms of bilateral trade, in terms of in the science field, from a financial standpoint, and also from the capital market standpoint. So the way I see it, self-reliance might be a sensible political, let me say, electoral objective, and as a consequence, in my mind, more short-term and sector-specific than anything else. But it is also a very complicated objective to achieve, as the recent US CHIPS Act seems to confirm. Besides, decoupling could be considered a double-edged sword in my eyes, because should it be extended to commerce, then both Washington and Beijing would need to find an alternative, to find alternative markets for their goods and services, which is of course a tall order given the sheer size of the American and Chinese consumer markets. So, all in all, while bilateral relations between the two countries are going to be tense for the foreseeable future, I also believe that the size of these ties is so big and intertwined that I think they could actually slow down whatever de-globalization process we're seeing today. As per the war in Ukraine, to me, the West is not looking that monolithic in its stance against Moscow. So I would really caution against thinking that the current war is a game changer for the Western camp. Just to be brief, two recent examples spring to mind. Since hostilities broke out, Spain has increased its LNG imports from Russia. And it's recent news, Japan has recently pledged its commitment to Moscow for the Sakhalin-1 gas project, which is a huge gas field just off the coast of Sakhalin. So, and even the much touted NATO enlargement to Sweden and Finland, in my mind, may not live up to its billing. To be sure, it should lead, of course, to a more effective military deterrence up north, with stronger naval capabilities in the Baltic region. However, priorities for NATO for member states, for NATO member states, will remain very similar to the past. China and Indo-Pacific will remain front and center for the US, and so will the fight against terrorism for Western Europe, and Russia's threats, of course, for Eastern Europe. So, given that the alliance is unlikely to change its voting system, which we all know is based on unanimity, it remains to be seen whether NATO's historical problems will actually dissipate with the big enlargement, which has been announced. And again, it's not a done deal yet, as we all know. What appears to be increasingly clear to me is that hostilities in Ukraine may actually affect relations across Asia. That is a game changer. Firstly, among Central Asian nations and Moscow, and secondly, between Moscow and Beijing. China and Russia likely will enjoy closer ties for the foreseeable future, but in the long run, I'm afraid this new partnership may look like a marriage of convenience. In actual fact, Moscow and Beijing are on two completely different trajectories and could find themselves at odds over strategic dossiers pretty soon, like, for instance, the Arctic Sea or even the access to natural resources in Siberia, which we all know is a contested region where there's a wealth of resources, and also the local population is not necessarily happy with the way Moscow is dealing with internal affairs. So the quest for independence by the local population has never been fully abandoned. So I think we're going towards what I call a liquid international order, one in which relations will be variable and adaptable, so to speak, an era of variable geometry. If you allow me to use this sentence. Critically, though, this new setting will benefit neither the multilateral orders, nor nation states. And this is very important because the first group will be lacerated from within by the growing competition among great powers. Besides, on top of that, Beijing is going to push for additional power. And precisely because China's role in today's international order is already tangible, such strategy will be countered by the US and by the West in general. This will generate, in turn, a struggle which will render international organizations even more ineffective than they currently are, I'm afraid. And if international organizations will find it increasingly difficult to manage the global commons, nation states and their Westphalian model are going to appear even more ill-suited for the job. Central governments have lost control over the last 20 years, at least partially, over security, both cyber and physical, over financial flows, over energy supplies, and so on. And in many cases, they seem to have lost control also over the aspiration of local communities to self-determination, which, let me remind you, it's founding principle of the UN Charter, and it's been often overlooked. I'm actually happy that the previous speaker has spoken about the Western Balkans, because that's one of the potential flashpoints for Europe going forward. And as I say, it's going to be a source of potential social instability, with potential spills in Western Europe. So today we're in a situation in which local as well as global factors are pulling at the fabric of the nation state, with its stakeholders are today local, cross-border, and international, just like, as I was mentioning earlier, ethnicities or debt bondholders or corporate shareholders, just to name a few. So the other point is the world order divided into two blocks, a realistic scenario? Well, in my mind, it isn't. China has a multitude of business partners, but very few allies. Besides, it remains to be seen whether Beijing's endgame is actually to form a bloc. Perhaps a case in point being today's Vietnam, which finds it very difficult to deal with a powerful neighbor like China. As per the US-led bloc, our values are going to hold, I think, but so will national interests. So rather than a more orderly global arena, I would say the resulting balance could actually be more chaos. So de-globalization should likely remain a significant undertow for a long time. But as I said, it will be countered. And just to name one, trade is here to stay, I think. Right now, today, it stands at 55% of the world's GDP. And it was even higher before the pandemic. And besides, from a political standpoint, again, probably from even more precisely from an electoral standpoint, any move in that direction would have a potentially negative impact on many local economies. It could prove to be a hard sell for those political movements, which in principle advocate autocratic models, but in reality are deeply rooted in export-oriented constituencies. So my key takeaway here is one thing is where to produce, i.e. rear near, or friendshoring. One other is where to sell. So the former impact, because the former impacts globalization, and the latter should keep it very much alive. Moving quickly to the European Union topic, the reduced effectiveness I envisage for multilateral fora going forward may provide, on an optimistic note, an opportunity for the EU to assert itself. After all, the EU is the only supranational we know of, effective supranational we know of. But the question is, will its member states keep it in the current limbo, or will they actually change tack and allow the bloc to become a geopolitical Europe? As we all know, unfortunately, the European Union is an unfinished project, and its own member states are still unwilling to assign to the supranational entity all the powers it needs to interact with Washington and Beijing on the same footing. Interestingly, just 2 years ago, an authoritative analyst here in Italy argued that the EU is a political powerhouse and at the same time a financial dwarf. Provided this has ever been the case, and I have reservations about that, the situation seems to have somewhat flipped nowadays. Brussels looks unable to punch to its potential political weight in the international arena, but it has managed to raise significantly his financial profile in the recent public healthcare and energy crisis. So maybe, looking ahead, a newfound financial strength could signal that Brussels is perhaps inching closer to its political Zeitenwende. And should this be the case, on the verge of turning 31, the European Union may finally leave its parental home, that is the veto power of its member state, and start a new life of its own. I'll finish right here on this rather optimistic note, and I'll switch back to you, Ekaterina. Thank you.
Europe as a teenager, not quite coming of age, but perhaps leaving the parental home soon, like that. Benjamin, would you like to share your screen, or? Okay, perfect.
Hi, yes, let me just see if I can do that. I've got some slides. There we are. Okay. All right, can everyone see my slides?
Looks good.
Great. Okay, so thanks very much to SEPS and Intereconomics, and especially Christian Breuer for inviting me to be part of this. And let me add my admiration for the standard of discussion that we've had so far, including all the questions from participants. I'm Ben Zismos. I'm at the University of Exeter Business School. And let me just sort of begin by summarizing what I see as the issue, as the sort of conference brief, if you like. Increasing competition and tension between US and China, the war in Ukraine, and the divided stance over the conflict are changing the geopolitical landscape. The prediction of a more multipolar world with dispersed power may lead to a world order divided into two blocks, one under US influence and another under Chinese influence. Is this a realistic scenario? My answer, yes, I do think it's a realistic scenario. A world in which all countries are unified under a single set of rules-based multilateral institutions may actually depend on one country being much more powerful than the others, where that country is the US and has been referred to in the post-war period as a hegemon. In a beautiful paper summarizing this really what I think is a useful framework for thinking about this, Matthew and Steger argue that, ironically, the fact that the hegemon is much more powerful than other countries is what gives it an interest in adhering to a single rules-based system under which it cannot exploit weaker countries. So their logic goes something like this. They say that in a world where you have one very powerful hegemon, it knows, and everybody knows, that if other countries engage with it directly, that they risk, once they make relationship-specific investments in with that country, they're vulnerable to hold up subsequently. And this actually leads countries to want to keep their distance, to not engage with the most powerful country, the US. And so as a result, the US actually has an interest, an incentive to set up and support a rules-based multilateral system. And the main center, the kind of center of gravity of Matthew and Steger's discussion is around the WTO, where we have a very clearly defined sense in which power operates. It's the power, the terms of over the terms of trade that the US holds vis-a-vis other countries. And then the idea is that the US has an interest in setting up formerly the GATT, now the WTO, with its central pillars being national treatment and most favored nation principles that actually prevent the US, that ties the US's hands not to be able to exploit its power on world markets against smaller countries. And it's this feature that actually gives smaller countries an incentive to engage with the US through the WTO, to draw them in. And this is something from which all countries benefit. And then the sort of paradox deepens in the sense that as the gap between the US and the sort of next most powerful countries shrinks, as there's technological catch-up, especially between the US and China with its colossal population and its sort of growing affluence of its market, it's that shrinking in the gap that gives the US an incentive to move to a power-based system, to kind of, to lose interest in the rules-based system and to move to a power-based system. And we've already seen that. What does that mean? It means the US starting a trade war with China, whereby tariffs become driven not by negotiated tariff reductions and exchanges of market access, but instead by who can leverage their power, the power of their terms of trade on world markets. So, and ironically, why does the US want to do this? It wants to try to reassert the power that it is losing over the countries whose gap, the gap with which is being closed, and so yes, it may be able to get to leverage to do some of that in the short run, but what it certainly loses is the incentive for smaller countries to engage with it through the unipolar multilateral trading system, and instead to gravitate towards the next most powerful country in the form of China. And again, we've seen this already start to happen, and considerable momentum build up behind it, in particular through the Belt and Road Initiative, through which China has really started to strengthen and deepen its ties, especially with African countries, but also with many smaller countries throughout the Middle East. Okay, so that's the sense in which I do see the formation of at least a bipolar world happening, and the incentives behind it. Now, what does this mean from a geoeconomic or geopolitical perspective? Here, I think the question, the sort of the kind of most worrying, alarming question we have in mind is, will this lead to another world war? And high-profile commentators like Martin Wolf from the Financial Times has actually signaled that it might. In an article, his most recent article in the Financial Times last week. So let me sort of address that question and assess whether I think that is the logical outcome of where we're going. And as a starting point, I want to sort of consider Norman Angel's idea, first expressed by him and later sort of picked up by various other commentators, that the gains from globalization make conflict, both economic and military, too costly. He made this this pronouncement before the two world wars, and subsequently this has been held up as rather naive and idealistic. And yet I think a more nuanced perspective on what he was saying is that if that's given this observation, it has to be that if conflict emerges, if conflict happens, it's because this process goes into reverse. Okay, so the direction of causality must run in the other direction as people turn inwards from the high level of globalization that was achieved on the dawn of the eve of World War I, and the high levels of globalization that we've seen recently. People actually have assert an incentive to turn inwards. And it's this that leads to costly and painful deglobalization. And in turn, it's this that heightens the incentives for conflict. Now, the logic here, it goes back to the famous Hector-Lean model. Why is it that people have an incentive to turn back from globalization? And the logic here is, well, you have large swathes of lower skilled workers who feel, whilst nations as a whole may be gaining, and in particular, whilst sort of urban elites and the highly skilled may be gaining, there are large swathes of lower skilled workers who have not felt the gains of globalization in a meaningful way. And it's those groups that are sort of pushing back against the forces of globalization. Now, this, I would argue, is currently happening via populism. Now, populism is a sort of very amorphous term, and yet a brilliant Journal of Economic literature piece that I'd recommend to everyone by Guriev and Papaioannou argues, sort of distills down, undertakes this sort of comprehensive look at over 200 articles on populism and distills it down to one common denominator. They argue that the key policy features of populism globally are a shift towards right-wing conservatism, which embraces nationalism and protectionism. This is, a rise of nationalist policies, and where the rubber really hits the road is in terms of anti-immigration, and protectionism, and again, where the rubber hits the road, is an increase in trade in sort of protectionist measures, be they through conventional increases in tariffs or through the rise in national subsidization of key industries. As Simon was suggesting, these are all measures that are designed to turn the country inwards on itself. Intriguingly, Guriev and Papaioannou point to the fact that this, the flip side of this is a rejection of the redistribution model pushed by the sort of conventional centrist and left-leaning social democrats. Okay, and I think I highlight that because I think this perhaps holds the key, this sort of observation holds the key to how we can actually move forward, sort of counter this trend in the future. So this is happening. There's a sort of thing that I'm saying that's a bit different from what other people have said, is that this trend is being driven by voters. Now, it might not be. It's true. I agree with what Isabel said, that it's not necessarily that populists are in charge, but that where they're not in charge, they're driving policy agendas towards the right. So the fact that Joe Biden hasn't repealed Trump's protectionist tariffs against China is as a sort of preemptive measure to try to preempt Trump's challenge in 2024. Now, there are two reasons for cautious optimism. I would say, and I'm saying against a backdrop of an increasingly entrenched bipolar world, is it all doom and gloom? Will it all end in a terrible conflict? I would say, differently from the 20th century, world war is unlikely to follow because we now have mutually assured destruction. Differently from then, we do really have this sort of colossal arsenal of nuclear weapons that is still playing this role of kind of giving us an end point where we just don't want to go. And so whilst I think that will stop us from escalating towards all-out war, I think local, regional skirmishes will be a reality. I think we will see ongoing conflicts like the one in Ukraine. We may well see China take steps to retake Taiwan. These will be serious and costly, but they won't lead to all-out war. I'm also, my other sort of bid for cautious optimism is that people are starting to see that populism is not the answer. Brexit has led to regret. We're already seeing that amongst some in opinion polls of people who voted for Brexit. So this leads to two questions that suggest implications. Should we expect to see a reduction in the international business activity and shifts in their geography? As others have argued, yes. In fact, as the data that we've seen from Alexandra, Alicia, and Simon have already shown, we have already seen this through COVID. We have learned to live with fewer connections to China. Some bounce back is likely, and again we've seen some of that as other speakers have already documented, but the bounce back will lead to less globalization than we've seen before. Question two, what does it mean for the EU and its role in the world? Here I agree with Isabel. It does present an opportunity. Sino-EU relations are less antagonistic than those between the US and China, but unfortunately, at a granular level, European nations are going down the same populist path of protectionism too. And I really see the policies that we've been talking about as being driven by this rise of populism. And the fact that this appeals to the median voter, if I can put it like that, as being the thing that threatens Europe from fulfilling the potential of the role that the vacuum that it could step into. Now, there is, of course, the glimmer of hope that voters realize that populism doesn't pay and move back towards a sort of liberal democratic centrist agenda. Here, I think the challenge, and what I sort of wish for every day but haven't seen so far, is that liberal Democrats come with a credible policy stance of actually, presenting an argument for how we reclaim, how we compensate the losers from globalization, which would in turn enable the sort of lower skilled to come back on board with a centrist agenda of expansion, of increasing the size of the pie through trade, and of compensation to make sure that there aren't significant losers from this. Now, of course, without a policy agenda like that already laid out, I wouldn't take my sort of cautious optimism about an end to populism to the bank just yet. Thank you very much.
So there were many thought-provoking ideas, and thank you for your presentations. I would like to encourage our audience to type their questions. I would like to ask one bigger EU-related question first, and maybe we'll see what we can develop from it. We've seen that EU sanctions against Russia have shown that the EU is capable of mobilizing its geoeconomic power in response to a big crisis. But under normal circumstances, agreement seems to be more difficult. Can the EU engage in geoeconomics, as in using economic tools for geopolitical purposes, without agreeing on its broad geopolitical goals? And we haven't seen that happening yet. So maybe, but if you would like to comment on each other's presentations first, please feel free to do so. But I would like to keep EU geopolitics in mind in our discussion. Simona?
Yeah, Katerina, if I just may jump in on your question. I don't see the unless the member states give the supranational, as I said in my presentation, the tools to play the game. The EU will not be geopolitically strong enough to play this game. I quote this analyst, the Italian analyst. I don't see how we can be politically strong and financially a dwarf. It doesn't work that way to me. Without a foreign common policy, there's no way out of it. This is why I believe, and I'm still optimistic, that we are, as a European Union, we are at a critical juncture. But it's a really important one. We either go one way or the other. There's no trading waters. We just have to take one direction for good. And I hope it's the one where the supranational can be actually a power on the same level as Washington and Beijing.
There is a question from the audience about de-globalization and globalization being the greatest peace project because it has established a mutual interdependence across countries. So does this phase of de-globalization today not increase the geopolitical risks significantly related to deglobalization and security? Benjamin?
Yeah, that's exactly my point. The phase, it is the phase. This is sort of this is an implication of what Norman Angell was arguing, that it is the deglobalization that heightens the risk of conflict. That's exactly the point. So so it's the more we retrench into a the more we back away from globalization, the more we give up the potential gains for becoming more affluent, more comfortable, and that is the thing that creates the heightened risk for conflict. So yeah, not very it has its risks. And then the question really then becomes, okay, so there's a greater risk of conflict. What will that conflict look like? Martin Wolf thinks that it heightens the risk of another world war, of all-out conflict at the global level. I would say, I think the world will look more like the Cold War. You know, the threat of all-out world war will hang over us. But again, the implications of that will, like the Cold War, be that we really just don't want to go down that road. The logic of mutually assured destruction will stop us from going down that path, just as it did in the 70s. But there will be a heightened risk of regional conflicts, for sure. Shall I go on and address this next piece of the question?
There is another question. Does the European political community represent a new, more agile way to address some of the challenges of a liquid international order, or is it somewhat something that will fade into obscurity? Isabel, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, sure. So the European political communities, I would say it's a forum for the EU member states to come to agreement and to find solutions with other European states on the big global questions, on issues that they need to cooperate. Will that have global ramifications? I'm not sure. I don't think it will fade into obscurity, because what we've seen with a largely geopoliticized world is that the EU is working more at the level of the member states. It needs more consensus at the level of the member states. It's less executive driven, I would say. The executive is, of course, so the European Commission is, of course, supporting and the member states, but a lot is happening now. You really do need, I agree with Simone, that you really do need the will of the member states in this sort of conflictual world to be able to be seen as an actor. And I think the European political community, if used correctly, it could work. It could work because it is a forum where you try to forge consensus with other partners on your continent, and the EU will need to be working, especially with the UK. It will need to be working with Turkey, with Norway, and it was, I think, also a sort of an appeasement gift for the Western Balkans, where if we have to be honest, it's an issue. Enlargement is something that has been on the back burner for at least 15 years. So now it's back in the arena with a vengeance, but it's something that was brought in because of making Ukraine a candidate, and not so much because we are looking at the Balkans more seriously. But it is still a very dangerous area. How we will handle EU enlargement is, I think, very critical, and not to be confused with the European political community. But it is definitely a way of forging consensus at an EU level.
Okay. Is there a room for the EU to move towards more opportunistic stance due to worsening relations between the US and China? Is another question that has been asked. Would you like to take that, Isabel? Or
okay, I would say really it depends what kind of US we have before us. If we have Biden's US, then this is a US that we can work with, and yes, it's a good opportunity for the EU. But if you have a Trumpist US, it's not really an opportunity. I think this is why I think it's very important for the EU to, you know, have more of a symmetric relationship somehow with the United States, and not be so dependent on what's happening in Washington, D.C.
That is a big challenge, indeed. Another question from our audience is, do you agree with Danny Roderick that globalization, democracy, and national autonomy are not compatible, as such supranational power is the way to combine national interdependence with democracy? How is the EU able to go this way? Simone, would you like to take it?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the way I see it, going forward, I think we should step out of the logic friend or foe. I think that's a point I will discuss in my paper. I think the most successful country or bloc will be the one who will be able to coexist. I think we have to step out of this hypocrisy, which more often than not, in my view, affects our political stance, our foreign policy stance in the West, because we've been hypocrites for a long time over many issues, and we tend to. I'm under the impression that we tend to raise the human rights red flag every now and then for opportunistic reasons, but we're not consistent. So instead of being hypocrites, we should say, okay, they have their own models, we have ours. We need to find ways to coexist. Exporting democracy, we tried it, I think, or at least the slogan was that, but other than the slogan, I don't think there was much meat to that slogan. So up to now, exporting democracy has not worked.
I could come in on that. I do agree with Danny Roderick that globalization, democracy, and national autonomy are not compatible. I think he builds a compelling argument in his book. I think the big question for Europe is, in sort of seeking to address that question, is how do you instill greater democracy into the institutions of Europe? One of the issues, this may be a kind of a sort of British-centric view, and I can say this as someone who voted Remain and is a very sort of enthusiastic fan of Europe. I think we need to revisit the question of how we get greater participation of voters as for MEPs and for democratic representation within Europe. That's really the only way to address the question to address this question about how you elevate the EU ability to address this trilemma. And I think it speaks to the previous question about the agility of the EU. That is the trouble in a way. People talk about China as being agile because it's a dictatorship. It's, I don't agree that that's an argument for, considering dictatorship, but it's an issue that we have, that in sort of coordinating our interests around the sort of the wishes of the populations is the sort of big kind of elephant in the room for Europe as I see it, in a kind of in kind of addressing these issues.
Thank you. There is another question to Simone and Ben about their views on geoeconomics. To what extent the potential emergence of two competing blocs could lead to a major reorientation of trade and financial flows? And will companies in market economies follow more prominent political objectives, national national alliances? I think that's an interesting question. Would you like to begin, Simone? You have to unmute yourself.
Yep. Very quickly, I don't see the birth of two competing blocks, honestly. So in that respect, I'm not too sure. People talk about Cold War because it's an easy example to go back to, but it's very different. It's a different ballgame. I don't want to get into the details, but the Cold War, people of my generation are used to, and it was a completely different game than the one we're playing today. Will companies follow more prominent political objective national alliances? Look, I don't think so. Companies will be driven by profit-seeking policies, and it's very healthy that they remain linked to that. So I don't see any major policy having an impact at a corporate level, honestly.
Benjamin, do you think that state control over firms can be carried out? Are firms going to follow, or will they find a way to bypass? Or
I think, I mean, my presentation is built around the idea that we will. The most likely scenario in my mind is a bipolar world. I agree with Simone that it's not so much in a sort of in a market-driven economy. It's not so much that companies feel obliged to become politically aligned. It's just that they respond to the barriers that will be put in place. So, you know, voters are voting for barriers. Those barriers are going to make it unprofitable for firms to engage internationally in the way that they have in the past. We've already seen European firms decide that it's no longer profitable to export to Britain. And likewise, we've seen that it's no longer profitable for British firms to export to Europe. That's just a feature of the tariffs that have resulted from Brexit. It's not politics, it's just pure economics. And that inevitably follows from, or will follow, if I'm right, that the world will become polarized.
the world is likely to become economically. I think I would like to, unless you would like to add something, I would conclude now. I mean, there are just very different topics, and we disagree on some of them, which I guess is a good thing. And there are certainly a number of challenges ahead for Europe, also with internal policies, politics, actually affecting international policies as well. I would like to reiterate that all of the presentations this afternoon will be published as articles in our upcoming issue in the November-December issue of Intereconomics. So please stay tuned and sign up for newsletter, and you will receive your issue of Intereconomics. I would also like to thank our audience for joining this afternoon to discuss the future of globalization. And I would like to thank our colleagues at SEPS and Intereconomics for organizing this conference and making it also technically possible. Thank you very much. We look forward to your papers, and I wish you a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.